Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, which today is on business, boardroom, and B2B conflict between businesses. My name's Dr. Mike Talbot, and I'm the CEO and founder of UK Mediation. I'm very pleased to be joining you here this afternoon. So just a quick word about me. I'm a psychotherapist, first of all, and became interested in the world of conflict resolution through some work I did with organisations quite a long time ago, and then in 1999 started UK Mediation to put together some of the ideas I had about how to bring what we know about the psychology of conflict and what makes people tick into the world of conflict resolution. So basically trying to understand people who are in conflict as a way of being able to better resolve their conflict and coming at it from that angle. So I've done a lot of work with workplace stress, mental health in the workplace and so on, and particularly looking at conflict as a cause of stress and mental health issues, and putting the whole thing together into our model and into our courses and services, which I've been running for the last 21 years. So that's me. Delighted to have so many people on today, not just from the UK, but from around the world, and to be ready to take your questions and comments. If you'd like to make any questions and comments, please do so as we go along. There's a chat box available for you to use. If you prefer to wait till the end, we will be leaving a bit of time at the end of my contribution, which will be about 40-45 minutes for a Q&A. So let's get on and talk about what we're going to do today. So in this webinar, I want to talk about conflict within businesses and between businesses, and also in boardrooms, about the nature of the sort of conflict that we can see in these settings and where mediation fits in. So it's not always mediation that's needed, but we can talk about the nature of mediation and how it fits into these settings, specifically in business and B2B conflict and boardroom conflict, and why you would bother. What are the benefits of using mediation in this sort of situation and these sorts of settings, and how you might go about accessing mediation or getting yourself the benefits of mediation skills. Leave a bit of time at the end, like I say, for a Q&A, and this I'll be talking for about 40 minutes. So here we go. What kind of conflicts are we talking about? The sorts of conflict or tension. We interchange these words: dispute, conflict, tension. I think conflict is a place where tension has got a bit stuck. And what we can talk about in that regard is within businesses, the kinds of things that can happen between shareholders when tension goes beyond just having a robust conversation into something where people start to act out, and where there may be some passive aggressive behaviours of people refusing to talk about certain topics, or behaviours such as people storming off or failing to attend meetings, or getting into factions, setting people against other people. So when normal tension within businesses, which is a fact of business life, turns into a conflict, this is the kind of thing that happens. It can be between shareholders. It can be where people have got opposing priorities because of their roles. So the financial director in a company may have a different, does have a different role than the managing director, does have a different role to the company secretary, and those priorities can sometimes come into competition, or the demands of those roles can sometimes lead to opposing priorities. And those of you who are involved in, particularly in the private sector, will know what I'm talking about. An area that we've worked with quite a lot is with family businesses, where there are loyalties that can come into competition between the tension between personal imperatives and professional responsibilities. So I've seen this in particular where family businesses are set up, they do particularly well, and then one or another party wants out. And there is legislation governing this, whether you've signed agreements or not, although people sensibly would probably have done so. But quite often there can be issues to do with taking customers with you, intellectual property around the company's products and services, family tensions that spill over into boardroom tensions. So these are the kind of things that can happen within businesses, or simply put, just general personality clashes and miscommunications. A can't get on with B, or there's been a miscommunication or misunderstanding between parties, which, because they haven't had a thorough and full-on dialogue, means that it leads to a conflict. So normal tensions, everything you see on screen there could be a normal tension within a company. Different examples of it there, depending on who it's between or who it involves. But when these tensions get so entrenched and turn into conflicts where people cease to have proper, robust, face-to-face, full-on dialogue, then it can turn into conflicts. And what we mean, the next level really, is when we talk about disputes, which is when those conflicts become standoffs. We get into win-lose standoffs, people start to take action against one another, and we get into more serious disputes. So this can happen within businesses. Similar things can happen between businesses. So what we can see here is examples of where contracts have been unfulfilled, where somebody has been provided with not the thing they thought they were going to be provided with. They paid for a product or service and it's not to their mind been fulfilled, or a promise has been broken. Unpaid debts is an obvious one. That's a very common source of tension and conflict and potential disputes between businesses. And also issues of unhealthy competition and copyright and patent issues, or turf wars. So where companies are competing for particular client groups or particular areas in the country, and particularly right now amongst all the issues to do with the pandemic, where money is short, where there are issues to do with continuity of people's employment, and where certain industry sectors are really on their knees. And I really sympathise with certain sectors right at the moment, especially hospitality and leisure, sports sector. Terrible situations they're in, and where what would be healthy competition can turn into unhealthy competition, where issues to do with, either turning a blind eye or just treating it as a fact of life that people are going to be producing the same products and services, these turn into big copyright and patent and intellectual property issues. Or we get turf wars where people are competing for the same client group or in the same area, and this spills over from a normal tension into a conflict and potentially into big disputes. And the third area is to do with boardrooms. So we can have conflicts within businesses, between businesses, and in boardrooms. And just to talk about this in a bit more detail, because it's an area that has increased of our work in recent years, something that we're doing more and more. I think because of an awareness of the cost and delay and distraction that unresolved conflict can cause. So the framework I've picked is Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. Some of you will be quite familiar with that. There's loads of stuff on the web about it, but it gives me a bit of a structure to talk about the kind of things that can happen within boardrooms. So what Patrick Lencioni talks about are these dysfunctions where, if they're not addressed, they can lead up the pyramid to further dysfunctions. So let's just take a look at that and have a think about dropping a framework to do with conflict and disputes over the top of Patrick Lencioni's framework about 5 dysfunctions. So the first dysfunction he talks about is an absence of trust. In order to trust people, you've got to take risks. There needs to be some vulnerability. You need to be quite honest and open with other people. We need to go beyond what's comfortable usually, and going beyond that zone of what's comfortable into the zone of feeling vulnerable and that there is an element of risk, it does tend to build trust. It happens over time. It happens more easily with certain personalities than with others. But if you don't trust people around you, there can be, when there are situations of conflict, there can be a real fear of that conflict. So imagine getting into a bust-up with somebody that you don't trust, or getting into a bust-up with somebody you do trust. So somebody who's very close to you, when we have conflict, day-to-day conflict, perhaps with your partner or spouse or family member, that conflict can be well managed. You can have candid debate. You can speak your opinion. You don't have any fear of retribution. You don't think there's going to be any comeback. But if you don't have the trust with that person, then that conflict can be scary. You don't have such candid debate. It's rather more guarded. It's rather more tight-lipped. You don't really speak your mind fully because you're worried about the consequences of doing so. So if we don't have trust, then that can give rise to a fear of conflict. So people don't walk towards situations of tension. And what that means is when we don't have the conflict is that people don't develop the kind of commitment where we can take into account everybody's opinion, where we can have healthy disagreements, where we can have decisions that people buy into. So in the absence of trust, where we're not having conflict, where we don't really speak our minds and have that candid debate, what you can end up with in boardrooms is a lack of commitment to decisions. So you get the output of that is that you don't have people speaking with one voice. So all of the work we do in boardrooms, what we say is that healthy conflict is a good agent for change, for creativity, using it as a source of power really, making the board more powerful by valuing healthy, well-managed conflict. This builds on people trusting each other, having good dialogue, and ultimately, as far as we see on Lencioni's pyramid, it leads to a commitment to decisions. So people get buy-in to decisions that are made as a result of the healthy conflict, so that everybody speaks with one voice. And if these things are in place, what that means is that people will become accountable. So when we put our shoulder behind decisions by having that thorough dialogue, we then become accountable, and we get 100% buy-in. So people say, yeah, this is something that I've contributed to, I'm bought into it, and I'm therefore prepared to be accountable. Otherwise, we get this avoidance of accountability, and ultimately, right at the top of the pyramid, we don't get the results. So with collective and individual accountability, with a healthy dialogue running through from the top to the bottom of this pyramid, with people who trust each other, are prepared to have healthy conflict, thereby to be committed to decisions that get made and speak with one voice, and be prepared to be jointly accountable and 100% bought into decisions and being prepared to back up those decisions, then we can get the results that the board needs. We have this both collective and individual accountability, which is a really important thing, and we get to deliver the measurable results. So what we're talking about with conflict resolution is working from the bottom up with this pyramid, promoting the kind of dialogue that can build trust, helping people to value conflict, not be scared of it, by having a well-managed conflict situation, and thus bringing about the commitment that's needed. So we're really working on the bottom couple of slices of Lencioni's pyramid, but in particular we're having external impartial input to boards where we as an organisation would provide that support so that that conflict can be had in a constructive and non-scary way. So how does that work? Oh, I'll get my colleagues to put a reference, a link into the chat box for Lencioni's pyramid as well, for the five dysfunctions of a team. So we'll give you that reference in the chat box as well. How does mediation work? Well, how mediation works is about having a mediator, somebody who is impartial, who uses a staged process and keeps order in the kind of discussions that we're talking about that need to take place either within businesses, between businesses, or in boardrooms, to keep order in the conversations that need to take place within a mapped out, well tried and tested process. So to lessen the fear that people have about conflict, about building trust and having a well-managed conflict, we have this impartial agent who may be from within an organisation or sometimes from outside an organisation, to apply a process and keep order with a group of people to help them to reach their own preferred solution to whatever the conflict is, to reduce the tension and ultimately to enhance decision making and commitment and accountability and deliver results. So we're getting people to reach their own preferred solution. Quite often within, as I was saying, things like family businesses, we find that there's there is a strong tension between family loyalties, and especially where there are members of an organisation, members of a company who've come in from out with a family. So somebody whose partner was not there at the start of the business, who then comes in and wants to influence what goes on within that business or organisation. Yoko Ono just sprang to mind there. It's probably not a very fair example, but so somebody who's within an organisation, they set up, they become successful, a spouse or partner then starts to influence what happens. I've seen quite a lot of problems in organisations, challenges where that kind of thing's happened. And here's a good example of where a mediator can be really useful, getting people to reach their own preferred solution, because as mediators we're working as facilitators, not consultants. We're not coming in and saying, oh, I can see what's happening here, I can do a forensic analysis and tell you what's wrong. So we're trying to avoid giving solutions to people on the assumption that the people know best what's best for them. So we tend to trust people to know their own needs and imperatives and drivers, and to understand what's actually best for them. So we refrain from solution giving ourselves. And there's two ways this can really be applied within businesses, the two varieties, which we like at UK Mediation to keep separate. It can get confusing when you mix these two things up. So let me talk about what these two things are. The first thing we talk about is interpersonal mediation. So interpersonal mediation covers a lot of disputes, a lot of sort of varieties of disputes where it's about people's relationships, it's about their communication, and it's about their perceptions. It's less based on nuts and bolts and more based on emotional experience. It's based on how people perceive of each other, how they communicate or don't communicate with one another, and how they relate to each other. There can be a lot to do with the history of the relationship. There can be a lot to do with how people get on outside of work and how they bring that into work, how they communicate or fail to communicate, and just what they imagine or expect of each other, really, the perceptions they have between one another. So that's sort of interpersonal mediation, very much to do with promoting a good dialogue between people, very much to do with quite a full-on and rather more emotionally laden branch of conflict. Second variety here is about commercial mediation. So this is rather drier. It's not so much to do with how people relate or communicate or what they imagine of each other or how they get on or don't get on. It's more to do with financial and contractual matters. It's to do with what people allege has or hasn't been provided under a contract. It's to do with people wanting recompense by way of goods and services, sometimes apologies, sometimes redoing a piece of work, undoing a piece of work, and often to do with an exchange of something of value. So the conclusion of commercial mediations, as opposed to the interpersonal, where we get a better understanding of the other party and where we get a better appreciation, they get a better appreciation of where we're coming from. In commercial, it's more to do with concluding with a contract or an agreement that the lawyers can make binding, which will define goods, services or money that have to be paid in order to bring a dispute to a close and in order to usually avoid court action. So they're the two varieties of mediation that might happen in businesses, between businesses or within boards. And just as a quick aside, there's a very good publication called Conflict and Tension in the Boardroom. It's from a couple of professors from Henley Business School, 2017. And it's referenced there in the chat box. So conflict and tension in the boardroom. If you want to read a bit more about the kinds of conflict and tension, what these guys did was a very large number of interviews with financial directors, CEOs, company secretaries, board members, and they found some consistent themes there about conflict and how people approach conflict. And there's a reference in the chat box for the conflict and tension in the boardroom. And we'll also put in there a reference to do with the 5 dysfunctions of a team. We'll put the Patrick Lencioni reference in the chat box as well for you, so you can have a look at that if you want to. So there we have it. So let's have a think about a little bit more detail about mediation. And just before I do this, a bit of a health warning. I don't think every conflict needs mediation. You know, I think if people are well able to talk things out for themselves and have the skills and the inclination and the trust, as it happens, and confidence to be able to walk towards conflict situations, we can sort, most people, most of the time, can sort most things out for themselves. It's just occasionally that we get locked into a standoff, we get rather rigidified, the whole situation gets very tightly bound up with perceptions and emotions and expectations, and often the influence of outside parties, and we get a bit stuck. And in those stuck situations, that's when it's helpful to think about using mediation or some form of facilitation to get the conversation unstuck and get it moving again. So let's have a think about what it looks like, this mediation thing, especially beginning with the interpersonal mediation. So interpersonal mediation, we have an impartial third party who gets a conversation going between the two people if they wish to. So it has to be voluntary, it has to be private, so that people know that their words are not going to be used anywhere else, or that things that they say that might be quite exposing or quite difficult to say, or might require quite a degree of vulnerability, they know that those things are not going to go anywhere else. So within that setting, what we can allow people to do, if they're speaking their minds, is to release tension, to let off steam, diffuse the anger and frustration that they feel towards each other and about the events that have taken them over in a non-damaging way. So we have various rules so that people don't wipe each other out, they don't persecute, they don't name call. And it allows that release of the tension to defuse that anger and that frustration in a way that doesn't damage anybody. And to better understand the impact of their own words and actions. So in an interpersonal dispute, quite often we have said and done things that have affected the other party. Often we'll hear in conflict resolution situations, they say, you did this thing, you said that thing, you did this thing to somebody I know or respect or I am related to, or you said this thing to my spouse or to my colleague or to my boss or subordinate or to me. So we help people to understand the impact of what they have said and done so that you can see how the other person has been affected. And the combination of these two things, letting the tension off to diffuse the anger and frustration, and also, seeing through the mirror that the mediator holds up, in effect, metaphorically speaking, how what you've said and done has affected the other person. What this allows to happen is that we build dialogue, so we can take part in a much more constructive conversation, in a much more future-focused conversation, respecting the fact that we have different views and getting to a place where that dialogue can lead to a resolution or action plan or statement of understanding so that we can resolve that conflict between us. It's not, in a sense, rocket science. It's a fairly technologically simple process. It's difficult to do well, and mediators will tell you that when you read the book about mediation, you think, okay, is that all there is to it? But actually, when you get into the heat of situations where you're mediating, it's something that I find has got a very big practice effect. As a mediator that's been doing this for about 21 years, I can tell you that early on, I sort of, with hindsight, didn't really know what I was doing. But it's something that does develop over time. It's a tricky thing to do. It's technologically simple. But doing it well and effectively certainly takes quite a bit of practice. Second area is commercial mediation. So in commercial mediation, which is more to do with, as I said, financial and contractual matters, what we have is an opportunity here to initially unearth people's interests. So what can happen in commercial disputes is we end up into a win-lose or zero-sum standoff with the other party where we get stuck into our positions. So one party says this has to happen, the other party says no, that has to happen, and we get very locked into that position, especially if disputes are left to fester for too long. Then we can get really dug in, and it's kind of hard to get ourselves dug out without having a sense that we are losing face. So what we're trying to do as a mediator is unearth people's interests and think about, well, why are you taking up that position? What is it about that position that serves your interests? And if we can get to that, which is harder if the dispute has gone on for a long time and got really entrenched, but the skill of the mediator is to unearth people's interests, usually speaking privately with people so that they don't have to show their hand to the other side. People will initially play their cards quite close to their chest, but the mediator's job is to build up the trust and the rapport with the parties so that we can discover what are the underlying needs, imperatives and interests that lead to people taking up these entrenched positions. And it can, with a bit of work, lead to a place where they leave those positions and rather start to negotiate so that they, with the other party, can come up with new solutions jointly. So the idea is, and this is it's quite a hackneyed phrase, it goes back to one of the original source books about that a lot of mediators use. We're inventing options for mutual gain. So what we're doing is trying to put our heads together and come up with options that would allow us both to walk away from that discussion with more than we started with. So in a sense, this is what people talk about as the win-win. So we're trying to find a way that if we put our heads together and jointly problem solve, rather than cracking our heads together and trying to prove who's right and who's wrong, then what we might be able to do is to invent a new idea, a third way, that would give us mutual gain, so that we both walk away from that conversation with a sense of having gained something. And ultimately in commercial mediation, in the same way as with interpersonal mediation, we're building that dialogue. So actually we're getting a better conversation going. So instead of the rather tight-lipped, rather passive-aggressive, rather clipped, rather reserved and careful exchanges that we've been having, we have a much more open and honest, full-on eye-to-eye dialogue, which can, in some settings, be very beneficial because you've got a supplier, you've got a contractor, you've got a collaborator that you want to keep working with, and you need to have that dialogue going. So quite often, if we go through adversarial procedures, like going to court or the employment tribunal, what can happen is that ends the relationship. They can be so damaging, those processes, and so expensive and distracting that they build resentment. And whoever wins or loses, if there is a clear winner or loser at the end of those kinds of processes, that has now spoiled the relationship between the two parties, which puts you at a commercial disadvantage jointly because you're not able to collaborate with that other party anymore. So what we're trying to do as mediators is to build the dialogue so that actually the commercial relationship can remain. We future-proofed it, meaning that if anything else comes up again, we've got a much better communication channel, and we're probably able to lean back on the success we've had within the mediation to say, hey, we got through that, we can probably get through this as well. And this is talking on the basis of UK Mediation's experience of doing this for 20 odd years. So many situations that would otherwise have gone to court and ended up wrecking the relationship have otherwise been mediated, and the relationship has actually become strengthened. So didn't want to go into too much technique about mediation today, but just a quick mention about reframing. So people say, well, how does it all work? It's probably too much to go into to give you a very full answer to how does it work. But one of the things we do as mediators, just one of the things, is that we're trying to come up with a shared resolution, be it in an interpersonal dispute or in a commercial dispute. We're looking for a resolution that the two parties can jointly put their shoulder behind. And thinking back again to Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions, what we're trying to do initially is get some trust going between the two parties to get them to volunteer for a mediation process. Can actually enhance the trust between them, where they see, each of them sees that the other one is volunteering to give this a go. And then where we can have a healthy, well-managed conflict, and where we can then lead that into some really committed joint problem solving, come up with a solution that the two parties feel fully committed to and accountable for, and ultimately can get the results that their organisation needs. So we can relate this kind of a framework to Lencioni's framework as well. But just come back to this reframing thing. What we tend to be in conflict is very blaming. We're saying it's the other person's fault, it's not my fault, it's all because of what they did or failed to do. Not only that, they knew what they were doing at the time. I'm blaming them, I'm saying it's their fault. And the other side's likely to be doing that about me as well. They're saying no, it's Talbot's fault, it was Talbot who's to blame, it's because of what he did or failed to do. And we get very stuck into that. So the blame and fault is something that we tend to hear early on as mediators when we're talking to people about their dispute. We tend to get a lot of horror stories that it's all the other guy's fault. We tend to also hear about past events. It's in our nature to give the mediator or anybody else who cares to listen this litany of past events that prove my point. It proves that I'm right and the other fellow's wrong. So I'll give you all this history. I may turn up with a few ring binders full as well of all the printouts from the emails and all the stuff that's gone wrong between us and the horrible thing he said to me and to my colleague and my company secretary and my financial director, to prove that actually it's all about the other guy and it's not about me. And the third thing I'm likely to do if I'm in serious conflict with somebody is I take up a position. I say, well, here's what's got to happen. Here's what's got to happen, and I'm sticking to it. So my position would be to say they've got to repay the £40,000, or they've got to redo that structure that they made for me, or they've got to give me back this intellectual property, or this has to happen. So the position is what we say has to happen. So as you can see, the way I've put it there is that in terms of where we start with in disputes, where we tend to come into a mediation type setting is blaming the other guy, giving all this history to prove our point and stating our position. And what we're trying to do as mediators, we're trying to reframe this. So we're trying to help people to shift away from this narrative about blame and fault and start to think about it being a situation of a shared responsibility to make this situation better. We try and help them to move away from past events, albeit that inevitably people are going to want to tell you all about their history. They want to prove to you that it wasn't them, it was the other person. And they'll give you all the paperwork to prove it from their point of view. So we want to shift people away from past events, usually after they've had a chance to offload to us, rather think about future actions. So what's happened. They're not going to agree about the past. Let's talk about what you can do differently starting tomorrow. And the third thing that we try and do, which I've alluded to already, is try and get people away from positions and into interests. So rather than saying this has got to happen, that's got to happen, we start to look at what are the underlying needs, interests and imperatives that have to be satisfied. And quite often it can help to try and get people to stand back, particularly in the boardroom conflict, to try and get people to stand back and just to remind them of their higher purpose, really, just to remind them of what they're here to do, what's the organisation trying to achieve, etc., so that people can then better focus on, instead of these sometimes very ego-driven positions that people will take, try and get to a more vulnerable place. Again, it comes back to vulnerability, where they can say, actually, what I really need is this, or what I really want to happen is this, or what I would really prefer is that. And again, it takes that vulnerability to show your hand in that way, but the mediator's job is partly to get people to that point. So we reframe to get from the left to the right. Our thinking about that, and my own thinking about this, which has been part of my sort of work over all this time, and the underpinning principle for actually my doctoral work as well, is to do with our own relational model. So this is a way of thinking about conflict, a way of trying to understand the people who are in conflict as a means to driving the model that we use to resolve that conflict. So essentially what we're doing with Retalk is we are talking about restoring dialogue, because our assumption is that conflict begins when dialogue breaks down. We're trying to repair people's relationships, and by relationships I don't mean husband, wife, partner. It's giving people a way to say the unsayable. So relationships are often spoiled because people are not saying what's actually on their mind, as we can attest to both with business and personal relationships, I think. So we give people a way to say the unsayable by the use of this model. And the idea is that we're trying to rebuild teams and rebuild boards, rebuild business relationships, rebuild the internal workings of organisations as well. So we're giving a structure, a staged, step-by-step structure to get everyone together and try and achieve the aims of restoring the dialogue, repairing the relationship, and basically making some rebuilding. Benefits of doing it this way are all about, for a lot of private sector organisations in particular, are all about cost effectiveness. So it's a lot quicker and cheaper to use something like this than it is to go to court. So I can't put that in simpler terms, really. It'll save you a whole lot of money. There's quite a few publications out there, if anybody fancies having a look, to attest to the fact that you can save yourself a lot of dollar if you try mediation rather than going to court. Astronomical amounts of money get spent on experts, representatives, advocates when you go through the court process. And as we know during the pandemic as well, there's an extraordinary long delay for court hearings at the moment. So we've seen this in people coming to us saying, we were going to take this to court, but we've been told we've got to wait at least 18 months now for a hearing. So we thought we might as well, in the meantime, try mediation. Most of the research on mediation will show you it's around about 80% effective, give or take. Some people will claim much higher figures. Some areas of conflict there will be a bit of a lower figure, without going into detail, but give or take, 4 out of 5 disputes are going to get settled through mediation. It's highly effective, so what you pay for mediation is a fraction of what you would pay for even a day's time of a barrister. So you know, you're going to save yourself a lot of money. The other thing is as well, you can get a lot of adverse publicity through going to court, as we know. So mediation is private. It avoids the exposure. It avoids your competitors finding out what's going on within your organisation. It can be a much more confidential it is a much more confidential process than going to court. What goes through court gets into the public domain, and with a few exceptions, you know, we get to see even the most intimate of disputes get played out in court, high value intimate disputes. So with mediation, you know, these are kept within the confines of the explicit confidentiality agreement that we make with all the parties. You can avoid that exposure, avoid that adverse publicity. Your competitors don't get to find out. Time saving I've already alluded to briefly. So most mediation cases will take place in a single day. There's a little bit of preparation, a little bit of paperwork for some commercial disputes, but ultimately the mediation itself is a single day. We end up with a memorandum of agreement, as I say, in around about 4 out of 5 disputes. And the lawyers may be attending on the day, or they may look at it afterwards and can turn the memorandum of agreement into a binding contract. It's often the case they do it on the day, so that you end up beginning the day in a rather win-lose adversarial position with your member of your business or your competitor or the contractor or agent. And you end up with a contract that is going to make that dispute go away for a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time that it would have taken, and also the chances are you and the other person are going to be talking. So you've preserved that ongoing relationship, you've maintained the dialogue with them, the door is open just in case anything else goes wrong between you in the future, so that you can still, you know, you can address future conflicts in a much more constructive way. So we're nearing the end. I'm going to talk about accessing mediation. In the chat box just now as well, there's a link there about Retalk, just by the way. So we've got a few links there now. There's the one for the ICSA publication about conflict and tension in the boardroom. There's the one for Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. And there's one there about Retalk, which is our conceptual model for how to make mediation work. As we move on to talking about how you might access mediation, again, you don't always need mediation. You maybe need a skilled company secretary to sit everybody down and crack a few heads together, metaphorically speaking. But you know, you can, in many situations, benefit from that extra layer of impartiality, the extra layer of confidentiality and independence that comes from using an external mediator. So you bring a mediator in from outside. I'm not going to do a sales thing on you here, but get somebody who's experienced, trained and accredited to the highest level. You know, don't think that anybody can do this. There is a level of accreditation that we work with, that we train people to, that we expect people to maintain, highly experienced and you know, the highest level of professional practice. They need to be, well, they will be independent and impartial. Not from either side's organisation, and usually not have had any prior contact with the participants, so the people who are in dispute won't know the mediator. He or she will come, you know, across their bows just for the day of the mediation. It will conclude with the agreement and then the mediator is off again. So you have that independence and impartiality. And the thing about it is they're only on demand, so you're not retaining anybody. They only need to be brought in, or at the moment accessed online, as they're needed, and we as an organisation can get you a mediator with 5 days notice. We tend to work rather differently than other organisations. We're not lawyers and proud of it, so you know, we are there to provide the mechanism and the process and the skills to get the trust going, to correctly and constructively manage the conflict between parties so that they can get their heads together, get back on with the job in a far more collaborative way, and we can get somebody out to you with 5 days notice. So that's if you bring somebody in. The other thing you might choose to do is to train your own people. You could go the whole hog and qualify your own in-house mediators, which many people are doing, or you can train your managers, team leaders to learn how to facilitate resolution meetings. It's a pretty simple process. Again, doing it well takes a bit of practice, and not everybody is necessarily cut out for it. But you know, if people can learn how to get others together and have a resolution meeting between them, It can be a really useful solution. And just as a bit of an aside, thinking about the publication that we've got there in the chat box, Conflict and Tension in the Boardroom, one of the findings of these guys was the sort of conflict around sort of decisions and issues better is addressed in the boardroom with everybody involved. But one thing they found was that personality clashes are far better addressed by way of informal discussion outside the boardroom. So one thing that company secretaries can do, or whoever is providing the skills here, is outside the boardroom, just get people together for a chat. That's as complicated as it needs to be. Learn the skills how to do it, get the confidence to be able to walk towards these situations. If people are falling out in the boardroom, we can take them aside, deal with the interpersonal aspects in private, away from board meetings, but the structural, decision-based, issue-based conflicts can be better dealt with within the board meetings, in the presence of your company secretary, if he or she is trained to a level where they can actually get good results out of the most high-temperature conflicts. Puts you in a really good position, and a much better competitive position as well. And the last thing you might do if you're thinking about training is equipping frontline staff with resolution skills. So where we're talking about interfaces between businesses, where we're talking about conflicts within businesses or between businesses and their customers, it can be really useful for the people at the front line to get these resolution skills as well. And there's a couple of training courses we do in connection with that as well. So everything's on our website. I'm going to talk in a moment about some other webinars we've got coming up. Just a moment really for a couple of questions that have been saved up. We've had a couple of questions by email. So Faisal has sent an email who says, our CEO and chairman can't seem to get on. We've had an external consultancy send someone in to come up with a plan, but it doesn't seem to be working. What can we do? Okay, Faisal, thanks very much for that. And I happen to know a little bit about that situation, and I do know that the external consultancy idea is fine. It's a very different approach than a mediator would use. It's rather less emotionally intelligent. It's about doing a forensic job on decisions that have been made. It's doing a forensic job on structures and management structures. And I'm sure that their recommendations were fine and well informed and very intelligent. But what we're looking at is an interpersonal clash. And that's not the kind of thing that can be as easily addressed by an external consultant doing a forensic job. Some of the problem is in human nature, we don't like being told what to do. So if there's an interpersonal fallout at a very, more of an emotional level between two people, for a third party to come in and say, okay, I've heard both of you and here's the plan, here's what you need to do, it actually doesn't work. And that for me is what's loosely called soft arbitration. And it's very far less successful to use soft arbitration on more emotionally laden interpersonal disputes. It's more a process that's suited to structural or issues-based disputes. So when it's about people, when it's more emotionally laden, you're better off using a facilitator, not a consultant. And a facilitator is somebody who has the skills of being able to help people to get more connected on an emotional level, more on an interpersonal level, to sort out the personality clash, as opposed to any structural or mechanistic problem. So a great question. Thanks, Faisal. Another one from Jenny, who says, as company secretary, Jenny, I often get called in to calm the waters between directors after volatile board meetings. What would be your top tips in this sort of situation? Thanks for your question, Jenny. Well, it's a long answer for that one. Give people a good listening to, Jenny. Work privately and confidentially. Make sure that they know that what they say to you is not going to go anywhere else. Have a shared understanding that the whole thing is what the lawyers would call without prejudice and confidential, so that nothing that gets said can be used in any other process. And then help them to have a conversation away from the normal workplace. Can be good. Take them somewhere else, somewhere private and comfortable. Give it plenty of time. Don't think you can solve this in half an hour. You know, they need to have a dedicated and serious amount of time to do this. So don't do it in public. Don't do it in front of everybody else. And then once you get them together, think about interests rather than positions. What do they need from each other rather than who's right or wrong? Get the dialogue going between them. Make sure they both have an equal contribution to the dialogue so that they can feel that any agreement they do come up with has been reached fairly. And those would be some of my top tips. But you know, at the risk of sounding a bit salesy, if you want to get sort of put the flesh on the bones of those top tips, I would suggest you do our facilitation skills or mediation skills for managers course, and you'll find out a whole lot more about that. Right, great questions, thank you very much. So to keep to my time limit, I'm just going to tell you very briefly about a couple of webinars that are coming up. If you want to visit our website, you'll find there's a whole list of them, and the link has just appeared in the chat box as if by magic. So upcoming webinars around the corner, we've got resolving complaints in housing, healthcare and higher education, 3 H's. So complaints are, you know, can take up a whole lot of time and energy of an organisation, and we've just picked these 3 areas because they are some of the areas where we get asked to come and provide professional help when complaints come in. I'm just looking at that cracking picture there with those socially distanced employees. I don't know if that's deliberate, but 2 metres between all the employees on that picture. So Friday 16th of October, about how you can resolve complaints through mediation in those 3 areas, and the same principles would apply to other areas as well, of course. November, we're going to be talking about transforming the legal profession. There you go. Have a contentious title, get people's noticed. So instead of turning to costly legal procedures to resolve disputes, which I've sort of alluded to today, mediation is very much an alternative. So there is this term, alternative dispute resolution, which the very, very old joke was that for the legal profession, the ADR of alternative dispute resolution actually stood for an acute drop in revenue. So we're looking at the overlap between alternative dispute resolution and the legal profession. So in my time, there was a period 10, 12 years ago when a lot of legal professionals, over the space of a year, suddenly sort of turned their attention to mediation and ADR and said, hey, maybe we need to get trained in this. So there has become this different branch of mediation, which is basically legal professionals doing what I would call evaluative settlement conferencing. There's a term there you might want to Google as well, evaluative settlements conferencing. It's a bit like it's a form of legal practice but uses some of the language of mediation, and this is what's come up over relatively recent years with legal professionals seeing mediation as a what would you call it, as a competitor to what they do. But we'll be going into these issues in a bit more detail, looking at mediation as a way of transforming sort of conventional legal practice, and that's at the beginning of November. And then the other one is the only other one to mention just now is about healthcare settings, 11th of December. So we're talking about NHS trusts and private healthcare, and we'll be talking about some of the work that we do in those areas for our whole range of work, including complaints, workplace disputes, staff disputes, issues that come up to do with patients and carers, and also some of the trickier, more sensitive stuff we do, for example, around NHS trusts making ethics-driven decisions to withdraw medical care. So we'll be doing some of that as well. Okay, I'll deal with that last question. It's just popped up there just as I was about to do my closing comments. And it's from Yatunde. Yatunde, hi. As a company secretary in a microfinance bank, directors ask me for ideas. Is it okay for me to join the deliberation as I feel it's distracting? Yes and no. I think, Yatunde, so if they're asking you for ideas for how to solve a dispute, and you've got them, if you know something, then share it. Yeah, absolutely. But sometimes when it's more personal, what you've got to watch out for is people hooking. So if A comes to you and says, have you got any ideas for how to sort this thing with B? And then B comes to you and asks for ideas how to sort this thing with A. The danger is you get hooked into taking sides. So you need to decide up front, Yatunde, am I an impartial facilitator of their conflict, or am I an arbiter who's actually advising from the outside and giving ideas to people which may, form the basis of discussion for how to solve a problem? So I think the best answer I can give you is decide which hat you're wearing. as an impartial facilitator who's not invested in the dispute and thereby gets, quite, as I agree, quite distracted by the dispute? Or are you somebody who's advising and arbitrating and who may actually be taking sides and forming an opinion about what's right and wrong? That's probably the best answer I can give you. Okay, so as ever, we'd like you to keep in touch. We have a YouTube that we would love you to like and subscribe. You can follow us on Twitter, you can connect with us on LinkedIn, or check out our Facebook. You can share and like our Facebook content. And that's pretty well us done for today. So I nearly kept to time. It's Friday, it's the weekend starts here. So thanks ever so much for your attendance, your questions and comments. I hope it's been helpful to you. If you want anybody else to see this, you can find it on YouTube shortly after we finish for today. Have a great weekend, stay safe. I've been Mike Talbot. Bye for now.